A walk to the edge of hell. The enormity of the World Trade Center disaster overwhelms rescue workers and relatives of the missing.
We're looking at those terrorist organizations who have the kind of capacity that would have been necessary to conduct the attack that we saw on the 11th. We haven't yet publicly identified the organization we believe was responsible. But when you look at the list of candidates, one resides in that region.
The United States narrows the list of suspects and seeks international support for retaliation.
We continue CNN's extensive coverage of America Under Attack. Hello, I'm Relitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. In a few hours, a new dawn will rise in the United States on a national day of mourning declared by President George W. Bush. The president himself is to attend services in New York and Washington, while authorities searching for those behind Tuesday's attacks cast a wider net. At least 8 people were arrested at New York City's 2 major airports Thursday. They were taken into custody for immigration issues and for carrying false documents, including, in one case, a fake pilot's license. Authorities say 4 of the men had been challenged by airport officials before on Tuesday, the day hijackers commandeered and crashed 4 airliners. Now all are being questioned by FBI members of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Meanwhile, the investigation has branched out overseas. U.S. and Philippine authorities staging a joint raid on a hotel outside the American embassy in Manila. Philippine President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo said the raid was connected to the attacks in the U.S., but gave no details.
Meanwhile, firefighters at the Pentagon had their hands full when a new fire flared briefly Thursday night. The fire was put out, and investigators resumed their search for the data recorders from the plane that plowed into the Pentagon Tuesday. On Thursday, search crews did recover the flight data recorder from the 4th crashed airliner, the Boeing 757, that went down in eastern Pennsylvania. And in New York, emergency workers sift through the tomb of twisted steel and concrete that was once the World Trade Center. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani says the latest estimate of those missing now tops 4,700. No survivors were found Thursday as workers struggle to recover bodies. Loved ones gather near the scene of the tragedy and at hospitals, anxious for any word of those lost. Let's go now to New York, where CNN's Garrick Utley is keeping track of all the developments in this story. Hello, Garrick.
Good morning from New York, Relitza, and the thing we're tracking right now is the weather. Even here in our studio, we can hear thunder outside. There's been a lightning and thunderstorm moving through, and the impact of that on the city has been down there in lower Manhattan. You see the lights on the smoke, which is still rising from where the World Trade Center was. And that has, for the moment, interrupted the rescue operations. The workers, though, are certainly not going home. They're hanging in there. And when this storm passes through, they will continue their rescue operations. Of course, quite aside from the search and rescue down there, although we've put rescue in quotation marks because as of today, during the day, no survivors were recovered. There is the question of what happens now. That brings us to Osama bin Laden, the believed radical leader of the terrorist movement. And Secretary Powell said today that he is the top of the list, most wanted man in the world right now. But how do you go about, how does the Bush administration go about tracking him down and doing something about what he did last Tuesday morning, or is believed he did last Tuesday morning? The real questions are, who is he, Osama bin Laden? Where is he? And what is it that he really wants?
The who is the easiest answer. Osama bin Laden is 44, a millionaire born in Saudi Arabia who has used his wealth to finance terror to fulfill his crusade against the United States. The where of bin Laden is mainly Afghanistan, where he built his terrorist camps. The Taliban regime there, which has sheltered bin Laden, has imposed its version and vision of Islam on Afghanistan. Women can work only in health and education fields and have few rights. There is a ban on using the internet and on importing movies, musical instruments, and even playing cards. Western aid workers have been put on trial, charged with the crime of preaching Christianity. In March, the Taliban blew up a pair of 2,000-year-old statues of Buddha, despite international appeals to save the treasures that had no place in the purist Islamic society the Taliban are trying to build. If bin Laden and the Taliban have much in common, bin Laden is more engaged in backing fellow Arabs in their conflict with Israel, which is backed by the United States, and in attacking the leaders of his homeland, Saudi Arabia, whom he sees as the materialistic pawns of a militaristic United States, which has stationed its troops there. And so it is the United States that has become, in Osama bin Laden's eyes, the evil enemy that needs to be cut down in size and power. Literally, brutally cut down.
And there is certainly a dark irony about this whole story with Osama bin Laden. The fact is that several years ago in the past, the United States played a role in helping make him what he is. Not a radical terrorist, certainly, but bringing him to the power and the stature he has among the radical Arab movement and Muslim movement, simply because of the conflict in Afghanistan, when at that time he was serving the purpose against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and he and bin Laden and many of his allies were supported by the West in their efforts against the Soviets. Well, now times have changed, the tables have turned, and one of the results is what we saw here last Tuesday. Let's go back now to Atlanta.
Garrick, just one question. What do New Yorkers want their government to do about this?
What do they want the government to do? Well, what do most Americans? I don't think we can really distinguish between New Yorkers and the mood across the country. They want the person who was behind this attack, or persons, plural, to be brought to justice. How do you define justice? Well, maybe if you can arrest the guy, you bring him before a court. We've had those trials here, right here in New York City, against radicals who have carried out terrorist attacks. The bombing against the World Trade Center in 1993. That may not be possible. Maybe there's going to be direct military action, as happened after the U.S. embassies in East Africa were bombed, and that was linked to Osama bin Laden, and of course a number of cruise missiles started raining down on his camps. But I think people here, as across the nation, understand that there's a difference between what we, as Americans, as individuals, would like to see happen, action taken, and whether that action is really going to lead to any concrete result that will diminish the possibility of further terrorism. It's a very, very difficult problem, and so far we have no indication as to what the timetable of this is going to be. How long does the Bush administration devote to the investigation before it takes some kind of military action? That's really the question that's hanging in the air, and we don't know whether we're talking about weeks or even months. And right now, we don't even know really how long the patience of the American public opinion is going to hold out on this. This is something that George Bush has to balance and weigh very carefully. Ralitza?
Garrick, thank you. John?
U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is definitive in what he believes needs to be done. Speaking on CNN's Larry King Live, Rumsfeld said maintaining the U.S. way of life in the aftermath of the attacks will require a war. Quoting here, a major, long-range, broad-based, sustained effort.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself, and that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies, and they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
President Bush has not yet said how he intends to respond to Tuesday's attacks. For now, he is considering a request from Rumsfeld to call several thousand members of the reserves to active duty in the next few days. The last call-up was in January of 1991 for the Gulf War. John King reports the president is not taking any of the decisions before him lightly.
The president choked up as he discussed the enormity of the challenge ahead.
I think about the families, the children. I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it.
2 days after the attacks, discussions with top security advisors include talk of retaliatory strikes, followed by a sustained international diplomatic and financial crackdown against suspected terrorists and their supporters.
Now's an opportunity to do generations a favor by coming together and whipping terrorism hunting it down, finding it, and holding them accountable. The nation must understand this is now the focus of my administration.
Sources say military planners are discussing options for retaliating against the lead suspect, Saudi terrorist Osama bin Laden. But one senior official said the administration was waiting to act because, quote, there might be not one but multiple organizations involved in this. Another served notice that when the administration does act, it will not be a one-time affair.
You don't do it with just a single military strike, no matter how dramatic. You don't do it with just military forces alone. You do it with the full resources of the U.S. government. It will be a campaign, not a single action.
The President and First Lady took time to visit some of those injured in the attack on the Pentagon. And Mr. Bush called Governor George Pataki and Mayor Rudy Giuliani to announce he will travel to New York on Friday to get a first-hand look at the worst of the devastation. But this interfered with the White House effort to project a reassuring image. The security perimeter around the White House suddenly expanded because of new concerns of a terrorist attack. Vice President Cheney left the White House and was rushed to the Camp David presidential retreat so that he and the president would not be at the same location. These new and ever-changing security precautions at the White House are the downside of what one of the president's closest advisors called an event that has transformed the country and what Mr. Bush himself labels the first war of the 21st century. John King, CNN, the White House.
For more on the president's reaction, we go now to White House correspondent Major Garrett. Major?
John, we have some news to bring you about the deal struck between the White House and congressional negotiators early this morning over a $40 billion supplemental spending bill to assist the efforts in New York and Virginia to recover and clean up after the terrorist attacks in both places. $40 billion is twice what the White House had requested from Congress, a clear sign of bipartisan support. $10 billion of that will be able to be released by the president immediately to aid those recovery and cleanup efforts. Another $10 billion can be released with 15 days notice given to Congress, and $20 billion is being set aside in what congressional negotiators call a reserve fund that the Congress will obligate after being told to do so or asked to do so by the president. So $40 billion, a deal reached early this morning between the White House and members of Congress. Late Thursday on Larry King Live, House Speaker Dennis Hastert said that the Congress, Republican and Democrat, would unite behind the president, provide him resources not only to deal with recovery and cleanup, but also to draft and approve a resolution authorizing the use of force against any terrorist cells or organizations thought to have been responsible for the attacks on Tuesday. President Bush himself spent time on Thursday, dealing with the after effects of the Tuesday attacks, visiting those who are recovering at the George Washington Hospital Center and providing whatever comfort and aid he could to those recovering there at the hospital. Also, he spoke by telephone, as John King pointed out, with the governor of New York, Republican Governor George Pataki, and the mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani. The president will fly to New York City later on today, Friday, to survey the damage from the air and also to go to the ground and see it up close. Before he does that, he will attend what is being described as a national prayer service on a National Day of Remembrance, the National Cathedral in Washington. Both efforts designed to bring the president to New York